Everyone was screaming and running. The young children were holding their mother's skirts or being dragged by the hand of their fathers or older siblings. The older mamas, often with little ones bouncing on their hips, were holding their long skirts so as not to trip, and the old men were trying to keep up with everyone. Sergeant George Long of the Vanuatu National Police was running too. He wasn't entirely sure why. He had 2 children in his arms. Minutes earlier, he had been walking around the tiny marketplace in the centre of Lenakel, the main town on the Vanuatu island of Tanna. It wasn't much of a market in terms of facilities or size. One open-sided roof area the size of half a tennis court. But the vegetables were plentiful, albeit all of the same limited variety. If someone wanted pumpkin or tomato, then they would be well looked after. But if they hoped for anything else, then it was going to be a disappointing shopping expedition. George hadn't gone to the market expecting to buy anything. He had just arrived from Vanuatu's capital city of Vila an hour earlier and was just waiting for his accommodation to be ready. The siren had started wailing as George was wandering from one pile of pumpkins and tomatoes to another pile of pumpkins and tomatoes, all of them tied up like little pyramids or mountains. A police car with lights flashing pulled up in front of the market on the road that ran past the wharf. 3 white Toyota Hilux pickup trucks followed. Before George could read the small logo on the yellow shirts of the dozen or so people who jumped from the 3 vehicles, George knew they were staff of an international aid agency. The cars were too new and clean to be locally owned. 2 staff from the aid agency immediately started yelling instructions into portable megaphones. Under the best circumstances, it was almost always impossible to make sense of anything that was being said when it was amplified through one of these conical loudspeakers. When 2 people were competing, it was audible but utterly incomprehensible. Despite George's inability to understand what was being said, those around him immediately turned and started running in the opposite direction, away from the sea and toward a nearby hill behind the market. A young police officer and the yellow-shirted aid workers were now waving their arms, yelling at people to go as fast as they could. That is when the screaming started. George looked around. He estimated there were around 400 people now running towards the hill. The road that ran alongside the market away from the wharf was 500 meters long. It had a slight incline. Perhaps there were even more than 400 people, as the road was dense with adults and children running and screaming. George hesitated. He still didn't know why they were running, but he knew he should help. He wasn't wearing his police uniform. George was visiting Tanna for a wedding and a week's holiday. He had brought his police identification card, but that was back in his wallet with his unpacked suitcase at his accommodation. He had taken a small amount of cash to the market, but figured there was no point taking the wallet full of credit cards and ID. He wasn't going to be using FPOS at a tiny market in one of Vanuatu's smaller provinces. George started jogging towards the police officer. He planned to explain he was a sergeant based in Vila, but was able to assist. "The other way!" A young man in a yellow shirt yelled at George as he approached the police officer. Before George could answer and explain who he was and why he wasn't running, a young child was pushed into his arms. George looked down. Another young child, a little older than the one he was holding. George guessed perhaps 4 years of age, was standing near one of the yellow-shirted aid workers. George scooped up the 4-year-old and started running with the rest of the crowd up the road. Even with the 2 children in his arms, George was still running past people, mostly older men and women, but also a couple of younger people on crutches and an old mama in a wheelchair. No one was pushing the old woman in the chair. The road was too steep for her to manage the incline on her own. Scores of people ran around her. She wasn't going anywhere. George almost stopped, but then realized he wasn't going to be able to help her while he was carrying the 2 children. He would come back for her, he thought. At the end of the road, they came to a car park. Just a well-worn piece of ground that probably served as a turning area for drivers who realized this road wasn't going any further. It was crowded.